recording, and we're starting now. So good afternoon, everyone. So we have Aleksandra Zaparuka with us, and we are happy to have her as a guest. She is a geography and English teacher from Poland. She has more than 30 years experience in teaching and teacher training, and she's got so much wonderful work that she's going to share with us. So over to you, Aleksandra.
Right, thank you very much for this nice introduction, and thank you very much for having me here. Yeah, I can't believe it's 30 years, but that's it. So what I prepared today for you are some soft CLIL options. I understand you are language teachers, but I would really like you to experiment a little bit with content, going into the areas that are interesting for you, interesting for your students. So this presentation has been prepared in the cooperation with Express Publishing, and CLIL Matters is my kind of company, if I can call it like that. So again, once again, thank you for having me, and let's move on. As it has been mentioned, I'm from Poland. This is the picture of my city, Toruń. You might not have heard about Toruń, but I hope you have heard about this guy. Nicholas Copernicus was born in Toruń, and I really like this connection because it also shows my connection to astronomy, because as a geography teacher, I had to teach about the solar system and the planets. So yes, Nicholas Copernicus was born in Toruń, and he spoke 4 languages. So this is also a great connection. I don't want to take too much time talking about Copernicus because there is a lot to share today with you. I'm going to be very brief, talking about CLIL as a method and types of CLIL. I understand you are here because you want to know more, but I suppose you already know some stuff about CLIL. So it's going to be very brief. And then I'm going to introduce you to something that I call the CLIL wheel. And the biggest part is going to be, options for EFL teachers, what you can do to extend the content part in your language classes. So CLIL as a method, I'm quite sure you might have heard a definition like this. This is just a reminder. So a situation where non-linguistic content like geography or history or biology is combined, merged with a foreign language. It can be English, but this can be Japanese or Italian or German or Russian. And of course, we can take this learning, teaching and learning also outside of the classroom. One big thing that I like mentioning is that contrary to earlier papers and earlier suggestions, CLIL can be called a single-focused rather than dual-focused. That my one goal is to help students to talk about the content of the subject using the language. So that's kind of a relief for subject teachers who can be frightened that now they have to teach the language. And it can also be a relief for language teachers that actually, yes, they have to take responsibility for the content, but they don't have to be experts. So very briefly, 2 main types of CLIL. And again, in an academic presentation, we could go into different types, but I don't want to go that way. For me, as a geography teacher, when I worked in lower secondary and secondary school, teaching geography through English, it was hard CLIL. So I delivered my lessons as part of a subject class. Subject teacher, yes, so I'm a qualified geography teacher, and everything was subject driven, which means that I had to follow the curriculum of my subject according to what the Ministry of Education designed as the geography curriculum for the specific level education. But I also was responsible, and every subject teacher is also responsible for the language. But we have to kind of define this language, the language of the subject. Not all grammar, not all vocabulary, but only this part that is needed for this specific subject. So as part of my lessons, geography lessons, was to make sure that my students understand the vocabulary that I needed in my lesson. But you are on the other end of the spectrum as a language teacher. And I also did that as a language teacher, working in a language school, doing a little bit of science, for example, here or there. We would then talk about soft CLIL, done in a language class by a language teacher. Could be English teacher, but can be a teacher of any other language. But the big point here that it should be also subject driven. So if I decide to do a lesson on history or a lesson on science or a lesson on any other topic, I have to make sure that the content is correct. I cannot compromise the content for the sake of grammar, for example. So yes, soft CLIL teachers are also responsible for the content. And I'm quite sure you would agree with that, because you are already content teachers. Teaching the language means also teaching, for example, a little bit of history of the country or countries where this language is spoken, or culture, or a little bit of geography of those countries, or politics or literature. So there is content already. So if it is so-called soft CLIL, you can show your students that you can use, and they can use, this language as a tool to talk about other things, other stuff that you are interested in. And there's going to be authentic content. There is a lot going on about, showing students authentic material. So this is it. Soft CLIL offers you some authentic material. You may motivate your students to learning a little bit more and spend more time on a topic if it is something that interests them. And other things include thinking skills. There is no subject teaching or learning without thinking. I don't want my students to memorize the content. I want them to understand. So there is another benefit of including a little bit more content into language teaching. So by saying that as a language teacher, you are also responsible for the content, and as a content teacher, I'm also responsible for the language, I can come up to the conclusion that actually I cannot separate one from the other. Content and language are just tightly connected. They are unified. So if you look here at this slide, I know you are language teachers, but can you recognize any subjects, any school subjects here? I suppose you don't have any problem with that, because the subject teachers taught you the language of those subjects. So we've got here geography, history, mathematics, chemistry, biology, music, physics, history of art. So yes, I would like us to think about content and language as two in one. So now I would like us to move to something that I call the CLIL wheel, which is an original proposal of combining so-called 4 C's of CLIL, traditionally understood as content, communication, cognition, and culture. And I would like to offer this approach to those 4 C's, having this communication, content, and cognition put together in the form of a wheel with the culture all around. I remember struggling when I taught geography. I remember struggling with this culture element and the need to include it in my lesson plan. Now I think that actually I don't have to do this explicitly, because the way we communicate depends on the culture, the way we think depends on the culture, and the content we teach depends on the culture. And it's not only the curriculum of history. I sometimes thought that geography taught in the UK, for example, is like a completely different subject. There's such a different approach to geography. So all those three elements depend on the culture. And with this model of the 4 Cs, I would like to integrate it with the so-called CLIL parameters from the book of Ball, Clegg and Kelly from 2015, Putting CLIL into Practice. They don't talk about the 4 Cs, they talk about 10 CLIL parameters. I thought of combining them and in this graphic form of a wheel as something that I can use in teacher training, and teachers can use when they prepare their lessons. Can I tick all the boxes? Have I got all the elements connected with the 10 parameters? So let's look at those 10 parameters. Some of them might be a little bit of a challenge for language teachers, while the others may be a little bit of a challenge for subject teachers. So, for example, the first one, we will be looking at those parameters connected with content first. So one of the big things in teaching subjects is a sequence, not a lesson, one lesson on a history of something, but a series of lessons on the countries of Europe, and a series of lessons on how the body works. So that's a big thing for language teachers to think about, okay? When planning using CLIL, plan it as a sequence of lessons. The next two, so concept bigger than the language and the task bigger than the language, might be something to language teachers might struggle with. Put away your language, look at the content first, and the language will be dictated by the content, by the concept you want to teach. For example, if I want to teach about the solar system, there will be specific language coming with that. If I want to teach about Henry VIII and his 6 wives, I have to use simple past, even if the students have never heard a sentence in a past tense. And the same, the task itself will dictate me the language. The next element shouldn't be a surprise, really. Multimedia input, videos, pictures, graphic representation of concepts. We need different channels to get to the student's mind. But this input should be guided. I need to support my students. I need to support my students in the language. Maybe I need to pre-teach some vocabulary, but I also need to support the students in the content, how to understand the content. I need to chop the content into smaller bits and pieces and check that they understand those smaller bits and pieces of information before moving on. The next parameter is a little bit different than the others, because it goes between content and communication. It is called 3 dimensions. And 3 dimensions are content, language, and procedure. So content, we know that's the subject we teach. This is my geography, this is my solar system, or digestive system, or classification of plants. With this, there is the specific language that comes, but there is also a procedure. So what am I actually asking my students to do? Do they have to read the data from the table and talk about that? Or maybe I'm asking them to read the text and find some elements there. Maybe I'm asking my students to use a map and get me some information based on this. So this procedure is something that kind of connects content and language. And if a specific procedure is a challenge for students, I need to make sure that I spend a little bit more time on that procedure. All of these three elements need to be kind of tuned in. And I remember teaching a lesson, a geography lesson that was so challenging in content that I had no chance of introducing a completely new procedure. And the other way around, I remember lessons when the students were so advanced, I could say, okay, here's your task, here's an atlas, do it. Because I knew that the procedure in this situation, reading specific maps, is okay, that they have already had enough experience in this procedure. Okay, and now I would like us to move into this C for communication. And this is going to be a little bit more obvious for language teachers, but this is something that subject teachers may struggle with. Key language, what to do with this key language. Key language meaning what? Meaning vocabulary, but also grammar structures or specific functions. I may ask my students to give definitions. So do they know the language of definitions? I may ask my students to show me similarities and differences between something, two countries, for example. Do they know the language that allows them to express similarities and differences? So there is a lot going on here, and of course, one of the tasks here is going to make sure that this key language is practiced. That I show my students this is something that you can use, and now we need to revise and recycle and practice. The next element goes into the instructions. In a CLIL situation, as in other situations as well, but here more important element, making sure that the instructions are clear enough. I don't want my students to be challenged extra by complex, messy, unclear instructions. So I always say, okay, can you make sure that you write down instructions, that you repeat the same structures, the same phrases? Can you add gesture? Can you make sure that you check instructions? Okay, the next one goes into student-student interaction. And again, for language teacher, that's obvious. Subject teachers might struggle a little bit here because very often there is not much time for extra activities. But if I want my students to understand the concepts I'm teaching, they have to be able to talk about those concepts. They have to be able to use the language that I'm trying to teach them, the language of my subject. So I have to make sure that students talk. They talk about similarities and differences or between different countries, that they talk about plant classification, that they talk about the solar system or the digestive system in the human body. The last one here is supported output. And by output, I often mean speaking and writing, but output can also be drawing or making a model or preparing a presentation, like PowerPoint presentation. But even if it is something like that, like a model or a presentation, I want my students to be able to talk about that model or mind map or a presentation or write about that. But this output should be supported. I cannot just tell my students, okay, off you go. I need to give them support in forms of the language, in terms of the maybe sentence structures that need to be used. I can give writing frames, for example, to show the structure, for example, of a science report. And although the last parameter is only 1 of 10, it doesn't mean that it takes only 10% of everything. It's a big thing. It's thinking. Again, I don't want my students to memorize. I want my students to understand and to make sure that they think. I need to be able to ask good questions. I can use thinking procedures. I can ask students to make mind maps because then they show me how they think about a concept. Okay, so this has been just kind of an introduction, combining 4 C's with 10 parameters. If you think about your soft CLIL lessons, you can look at those 10 elements and you can just think, okay, have I got this? Can I tick this or that box? But the main part here is, what you can do as a language teacher. I would say you've got freedom of going in the direction that I, as a subject teacher, cannot go. I'm kind of constrained by the curriculum I have to teach. Whereas if you are a language teacher, you can choose this or that content. So I will be talking about those soft CLIL options, but you might have heard also this term content enhanced language teaching. So a little bit more content in teaching the language. I'm going to give you 6 options. I don't want to say that's it. I suppose you can come up with more, but at the moment I have made a list of 6. So one of the first things you can try and do is to extend your course book. What do I mean by extending your course book? For example, you talk about food in your language teaching, food products, recipes, diets, and so on. You talk about clothes, fashion, patterns, shopping for clothes, following fashion or not following fashion. So those 2 topics can be followed by a lesson on waste. This is a huge thing. And it's a very natural kind of continuation. Yes, food waste, clothes. Do we need that many? Okay, so you can kind of include education for sustainable development based on the material or going from the material in your course book that you do anyway. And I've got here some links to websites where you can find ready material. like, for example, the first one is United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And what you can find there are actually in English. There is all the information you need. You can send your students there, and you can also find their lesson plans. So that's one. I've got another here. It's called Global Dimensions, and that's World's Largest Lesson. And again, there are ready materials there, activities, online maps, lesson plans. Okay, they are not designed for language learners. You might say the language level is too difficult and so on. So you may try the last one that I'm going to show here. This is Keith Kelly's website. I know you had Keith Kelly here yesterday. It's a brilliant program for young people. You can access lesson plans for language learners on waste, and you can get in touch with students in other countries working on the same content. So there is a lot going on. A lot of the material is already in English, which means that we are in a better situation than, for example, teachers of other languages. So that's one thing. Extend your course book. The next one that I could suggest is going into fun science. If you go on YouTube, you can find a lot of fun experiments that you can grow into. You can build on top of that all the language. For example, a lava lamp. Oops. Yeah, you can try and do this experiment with your students. If you are interested in doing science in language classes, I've got a 2-page handout that you can use with a little bit older students, like 13 or 14 years old. But it doesn't mean you cannot, if you are interested, you can get in touch, but it doesn't mean I cannot use this experiment with younger students and with the students whose language is not that advanced. For example, here I've got posters based on the same experiment, but done with, if I remember correctly, 8 and 9-year-olds. You can see that the poster on the right, you can see the student had a little bit of problems with even writing. But of course, in this situation, the experiment was very much controlled, but we used the language, proper academic language, ingredients, hypotheses, observations, conclusions. And you may say, yeah, but are the students going to remember this vocabulary? Actually, that was my concern. So part of the class was to work on the vocabulary, typical vocabulary exercises in a language class. But next week, we had another experiment. On the left, you can see those 3 balloons, and that was an experiment that was to show which acid is going to produce the most gas. And we put some baking powder into the balloons, and the 3 bottles have got 3 different types of acid: vinegar, lime juice. I don't remember the third one, but you can see that the middle one has produced the largest amount of gas. So that was another experiment that enabled me to look through the vocabulary again. What is your hypothesis? These are observations. What are the conclusions? And the poster on the right shows another experiment. I brought different objects to the class, and you can see cork, wooden stick, mandarin, candle, a piece of limestone, a magnet. And the students were to hypothesize, so predict what is going to happen with those objects when you put them into the water. Are they going to sink or float? And of course, then we had a big bowl of water. There was a lot of fun. The students had to test and check what happens. And the product is this Venn diagram, and you can see there are some objects that are in between, depending on different situation. Sometimes they floated, sometimes they sank. So a third experiment, and I again could go into the vocabulary. What is your prediction? What is your hypothesis? Let's observe. What are the conclusions? And there is a lot of fun. And you have to be prepared that the students might go into, might start experimenting a little bit too much. It's good to have paper towels or toilet paper, but there is a great way of learning academic vocabulary. The next thing that you can do is to explore the area you live in. I'm going to be talking about Canterbury in County Kent, Southeast England. But of course, what you are going to be talking about with your students is going to be dependent on your region, on your city. So I don't know how much you know about Canterbury or County Kent, but there is a connection to literature. Canterbury Tales, so Geoffrey Chaucer, so literature. But there is a strong connection to geography. I can look at geology, rocks, geological structures, different processes. I can look at cartography, look at maps, geological maps, historical maps. If you are not into literature or geography, maybe history. So Canterbury, there is a strong link to Middle Ages and the story of Archbishop Thomas Becket and the conflict between the Archbishop and King Henry II. An Archbishop was murdered in the cathedral and pilgrimages started. So I may go that way. But maybe architecture is something that is interesting. I can look at materials, local materials. I can look at the buildings, church buildings and other buildings. And what is brilliant here is that I can show my students how elements of different disciplines are connected. For example, here, this red circle, chalk and flint, are two types of rocks on the south, chalk cliffs, beautiful. But chalk and flint are building materials, so architecture. And chalk and flint were used to build, for example, Pilgrim's Hospital in Canterbury that was used for pilgrims coming to see Thomas Becket's grave. Oh, Thomas Becket, so I've got Canterbury Tales. So I can show my students interconnections between different disciplines. And this is something that is really important because in schools, we chop knowledge into disciplines. We talk about geography and history. This is mathematics, this is physics. Whereas in reality, everything is so much interconnected. And this is a great way to show the students that, look, I'm talking about my city, but I cannot show I cannot separate geography from history and history from literature and literature from architecture. So think about that option. You can use CLIL pages. I know that some course books have already started including so-called CLIL pages. Sometimes these are also culture pages talking about the culture or history of specific countries where the language is spoken. But sometimes there are CLIL pages like this. go and explore those. And you can also explore CLIL readers. By exploring CLIL readers, you may see, you may have one box ticked off, that you can choose the language level. You can adapt the language level of the reader to your students. But what I would like you to be thinking about is that when you use a CLIL reader, try and as well go beyond the content. For example, there is a CLIL reader on ancient Egypt. But if I talk about the Nile, I can go into geography. If I talk about the Egyptian god Ra, I can go into astronomy. Writing and counting, maths today. Sphinx, I can go into geology and art. Mummification, biology, what happened to different body parts? How did they do that? Building pyramids, oh, that's geometry. And it's physics, it's pull and push forces. How did they manage to build those pyramids with those tools? Talking about wheat production in Egypt, oh, that's a geography. So again, there is a CLIL reader about ancient history, but I can find connections to the subjects that my students are doing now. And again, I can show them, look, we can talk about disciplines, but there is just one big knowledge there. And one thing more, you can think about, you can design your own cross-curricular project. I know Keith Kelly talked about projects. This is my suggestion. Water is a brilliant idea to talk about, because you can talk about water in music, the sounds, in physics, physical properties of water, water sports, water in biology, for human body, for fish and other species. Chemistry, properties of chemical properties of water. Water in geography, rivers, seas, lakes. Literature. Are there any stories going on at the seaside or on the water? Are there any connections between water and history? For example, the ancient history of Egypt is based on the River Nile, so water. Economics, water today, how much it costs to have clean water. Have you got clean water? Has everyone got clean water? How about technology in water? Aqueducts in ancient Rome, for example, and water pipes today. Art, paintings of lakes and rivers, but also watercolors. Citizenship, should we be using bottled water? How much it costs to bottle water? Politics, so conflicts about water. A lot of examples. And mathematics. So look how many topics you can cover, but there is this one area, one term or one topic that is central, water in different subjects. I think this is really exciting, because there is so much that you can choose what you like, and you can leave the choice to your students. Let's say you show them this slide and say, okay, who would like to prepare a presentation and tell us something about water in this area? But whatever you choose, I would like you to be thinking about those 5 kind of golden rules about content and language integrated learning in a language class. So think of a series of lessons, not just one. Talk to subject teachers in your school. They will help you what do your students already know? What is specific that those teachers are doing in their subjects that you can feed into your lesson? Content before the language. So you choose the content and the language comes with it, rather than the other way around. And also think of the content as something that needs to be assessed as well. Not only can they do grammar. And challenge yourself and challenge your students. I think that's a big thing. To challenge yourself as a teacher, go into the area that you don't feel confident about, or pushing your students into the area that they don't feel confident about. Yeah, we are getting to an end. These are my references. You can find me on Facebook, CLIL Matters for Primary and CLIL Matters for Secondary. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you can follow me on social media, and you can get in touch, especially if you want to try some of the lessons. Yeah, CLIL Matters is something that matters to me. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aleksandra. This was very interesting. And I love this pictures from the real lessons and the experiments and the one with the portal. And we would love that handout,
Oh,
the
yeah.
two-page handout, of course, yeah, because we'd like our teachers to be able to repeat what they hear at the conference. Yeah, there have been some questions, so
Okay.
I would like to, yeah, the people are saying so interested and useful. Yes, thank you. So, thank you. So the first question, ESP and CLIL, are they overlapping?
Yeah, there is a little bit of a different kind of stress, because ESP is English for specific purposes. So it means that you teach the language. The language is your main objective. You teach the language for engineers, you teach the language for doctors. Whereas when I look at CLIL, I look at the content first. It's a little bit, I mean, I would say that they overlap, but not completely. Mainly because when I talk about ESP, my main goal is the language of that profession. Whereas if I'm a geographer, I want my students to understand concepts in geography.
Yeah. Also, you know, in ESP, very often the students would know the lexis already. Because they read the professional text, and for sure they know the content much better than the teacher.
Yeah.
But you need to teach them functions and being able to actually do something with this language. So it's a different focus. Yes, I would say that there is some overlapping, of course, but they are quite different in nature. Yeah, so the next question is, do you have this kind of lessons in a traditional secondary school or in a school with advanced English learning?
Well, actually, I understand that the situation can be different in different countries. In my context, the students in bilingual programs had to take a special exam in English, in a language that is going to be used later on. So I was kind of privileged in the way that the students' language level was okay. But I know about programs, like even in my city, there was a French lower secondary with French as the main language. And the students who came to the class, to this program, knew no French, not at all. So they would have a year of very intensive French language learning. And then they would introduce biology and chemistry through French. But of course, they would be learning both very slowly and painfully, I suppose, the content and the language at the same time. So that's the thing here, that, well, in many contexts, we select students because of the language, but it doesn't mean that's the only option. I can even say that students who struggle with content in a kind of normal situation may do better in a CLIL class because the teacher has to change the way of teaching. I have to check understanding. I have to give them support in terms of the language and in terms of the content. So overall, even if it is in a foreign language, the students may understand concepts better, not because irrespectively of the language, but because the teacher changes the way of teaching. I have to consider the fact that the students may have a language problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Aleksandra. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure a lot of people will write to you. They have your contact details, yeah, and I'll be waiting for that handout as well.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to send this handout to you as well if you want to post it somewhere on your website. Like, okay, this is an option for teachers to work through. That would be really cool to know how they have managed with that content. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.